Yesterday, Donald Trump was the target of another assassination attempt, although this one went wildly different from the first in that the gunman was identified, neutralized, and taken alive by Secret Service before he could actually shoot the former president. However, Fox News and MAGA Republican congresspeople are wasting no time attempting to publicly blame the Democrats for this attempt on Trump's life, and we have to talk about it. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video. I should say I did not do any videos or any coverage about the attempted assassination attempt on Trump yesterday for a couple of reasons. Number one, I was emotionally exhausted. And number two, details about the attempt were still incoming. And as a matter of fact, the initial reports were contradicted very vividly by subsequent reports. So initially it was reported that there happened to just be a gunfight effectively between two gunmen near Mar-A-Lago. We didn't even know if it was an assassination attempt. And then, of course, details came out which wildly contradicted it. It was one gunman. His target was Trump. And again, he was identified, disarmed, and neutralized, taken alive before he could actually get a shot off. Okay, so for all these reasons, I just wanted to wait until today, until we had more information. I thought that that was the more responsible thing to do. So we are going to get into details about the assassination attempt. I'm sure you're familiar with many of them, but I do want to start with the clips, the real topic of the discussion, which is that MAGA Republican elected officials and Fox propagandists are trying to blame Democrats for this attempt on Trump's life. We'll get into why that's so ridiculous, but here is a MAGA Republican Congressman Moser, attempting to do just that alongside Fox propagandist Maria Bartiromo.
More of the same, with lots of smears from the Democrats calling Trump the next Hitler, a threat to democracy, primary spreader of fascism, and an existential danger to the nation. Do you believe that this rhetoric is behind these attempts?
There's no question. In fact, the rhetoric is increasing the heat, not diminishing it. And if the Secret Service and the Biden administration and Homeland, Mayorkas has a lot of responsibility here, would come out and actually say, this is what we're doing to assure the safety of President Trump, of Vice President Harris, that would also create a deterrence. But as you're stating, this rhetoric, calling him evil, calling him Hitler, how he's going to, he's an existential threat to democracy. Okay, that diminished for about a week after July 13th, and it came roaring back, particularly during their convention.
Of course, the problem is that Donald Trump is indeed a threat to democracy, and that fact is not changed or altered by the fact that Donald Trump was also the target of a morally reprehensible and unlawful assassination attempt. Again, these things exist. They can exist side by side. Two things can be true at once. There's no contradiction. We'll get into all of that, though, but I just, again, want to show you that an elected official alongside a Fox propaganda host is blaming Democratic rhetoric for this attack on Trump's life. And they're not alone. Here's another clip.
Do you blame, Congressman, the constant drumbeat from the left that Trump is a threat to democracy for yesterday's attempt and yet another attempt on his life?
100%. After January 6th, Nancy Pelosi called all of us Republican members of Congress domestic terrorists. Those words are impactful to people that are looking to do harm to people. So we've been called domestic terrorists. They're repeated calls that Trump is a threat to democracy, which is actually the left. I mean, Kamala Harris hasn't had a single person vote for her for president, and she's the nominee. I mean, if there's not a more threat to democracy, it's that she was picked behind closed doors in a Democratic convention, and then she's the person that they put out with not a single person voting for her.
The delegates voted for her. The same process that was employed to elect and appoint Democratic nominees since time immemorial is the same process that elected Vice President Harris with respect to becoming the Democratic nominee. President Biden was the incumbent. People voted for him in the primary, knowing that Vice President Harris would be his running mate, his number two, his replacement, should he resign or die or something bad happen to him, as she is the incumbent vice president and his current running mate. Everybody knew that. And President Biden made the decision to withdraw from the race due to the fact that he was persuaded by Nancy Pelosi, by Barack Obama, by George Clooney and others that the likelihood of him beating Trump in this next election was sufficiently lower such that it jeopardized the entire election. Biden made a personal choice. Nobody forced him out. Nobody could force him out. Had he decided to remain the candidate, delegates would have voted for him anyway. The power was all his. The fact that other people pressured him is not anti-democratic. He was not bound by law to remain the Democratic nominee. So this is all ridiculous. But again, this is a MAGA Republican Congressman, Greg Stube, another one, publicly blaming Democrats for what happened to Donald Trump. One more clip, then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of it. There's another MAGA Republican congressperson also on Fox News saying the same stuff.
That is just the rhetoric. And, people are at each other's throats. Do you see that as a contributing factor in Butler, which you've already looked at?
Absolutely. The rhetoric is every day, all day. And as it's directed against President Trump, it's saying that he's a threat to democracy, that he's going to destroy America. It's absolutely absurd, and it is irresponsible. And Democrats and people who are speaking in these terms about President Trump need to take responsibility and really think about the consequence of using that kind of language. Right. Because here we are again. And so in the days immediately after Butler, we heard people accept that needed to stop, but it didn't last. And that today is a day that needs to be taken seriously.
It lasted.
You can see that she's full of shit from the smile on her face because, of course, when right-wing violence is perpetrated, basically when the perpetrator is right wing, which is almost always the case, and people say, well, hey, Republicans, maybe you shouldn't be radicalizing right wing extremists to taking violent actions. They say, well, wait a minute, our rhetoric has nothing to do that. We can't be held morally, certainly not legally, but we're not even morally responsible for what people who happen to share our ideology and are motivated by the things we say. We can't be held responsible for that. That makes no sense. But of course, when it comes to Democrats, they have to be held to a wildly different standard because that's the only thing that Republicans know how to do is employ double standards. They can't compete in the marketplace of ideas by adhering to the same standard they try to impose on others. So with that in mind, what do we know? Just a brief recap about the shooting. Then we'll get into, again, why this entire argument is nonsense. So this is a timeline from The Guardian. The Republican presidential candidate and former U.S. President Donald Trump is safe and unharmed after U.S. Secret Service agents opened fire when they spotted a person with a firearm at the Trump International Golf Course west of Palm Beach, where the former president's Mar-A-Lago resort home is located. Law enforcement officials said the gunman was in some bushes near the property line of the golf course when Secret Service agents, who were clearing holes ahead of where Trump was playing, spotted a rifle barrel in the bushes. Agents engaged the gunman and fired at least 4 rounds of ammunition about 1:30 p.m. local time. The gunman dropped his rifle, 2 backpacks, and other items and fled in a black Nissan car. A witness, the sheriff said, saw the gunman and managed to take photos of his car and license plate. Okay. In a press conference, Palm Beach County Sheriff Rick Bradshaw said a male suspect had been detained by authorities. According to Bradshaw, the suspect was relatively calm. Officials acknowledged that because Trump is not in office, the full golf course was not cordoned off. If he was, we would have had the entire golf course surrounded. Because he's not, security is limited to the areas the Secret Service deems possible. We'll probably do a video on this because, of course, Republicans are apoplectic. How dare you not give Donald Trump equal protection to President Biden? Well, President Biden is the president of the United States. He is commander in chief. He is head of state. He is head of government. And I say this without any, basically irrespective of party. But the sitting president, doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat, Trump or Biden, they're simply the more important target. It's more important that Secret Service devote more resources to protecting the sitting president, no matter who that is, than a former president. That applies to Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump. The sitting president is simply the more important VIP, the more important principle to protect. So it makes sense that in a security agency that doesn't have unlimited resources, more effort is put towards protecting the current president than the former. Not particularly controversial. The gunman was spotted between 300 and 500 yards from where Trump was playing. The FBI has called the incident what appears to be an attempted assassination of the former president. The suspect has been identified, and again, we'll get into some of his or her political beliefs. But again, Trump was not shot at. As a matter of fact, he was even joking that he wanted to continue to golf. Okay. And I should also note that Democratic leadership from President Biden, Vice President Harris, Governor Tim Walz, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, all released immediate statements condemning the violence. Last thing we'll say before we, again, address the meat and potatoes of why it's still okay. Not only is it okay, it's perfectly reasonable to call Donald Trump a threat to democracy, even though he is the target of assassination attempts. Before we get into that, we should point out that the suspect, at least based on what we know now, his political views were all over the place. This is according to Axios, summarizing it. Before X suspended his account on Sunday, Ruth had posted online statements that indicated he was a Trump supporter in 2016. This guy voted for Donald Trump in 2016. However, he turned against Donald Trump by 2020. And then he later expressed support for a ticket involving former Republican presidential primary candidates Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley. Records indicate that he voted in the North Carolina Democratic primary in March. He made more than a dozen small donations in 2019, so 5 years ago, totaling more than $100 to Act Blue, which handles Democratic contributions. Okay. In several posts on X in 2020, he expressed support for former Democratic candidate Tulsi Gabbard, who is now a Trump supporter. His political views are all over the place. He donated in small dollars 5 years ago to Democrats. He was a Trump voter. Then he backed Tulsi Gabbard, a conservative Democrat who became a Trump supporter. And then, even though he was anti-Trump, he supported Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy. So based on what we know, it would be most accurate to say that this guy is a conservative Republican who is also an ever-Trumper. Seems to me he prefers a anti-Trump or a non-Trump Republican candidate over the Democrats. Okay, but again, this is based on what we know preliminarily, based on social media posts. Now, Jonathan Chait from the New York Magazine wrote an article discussing this idea that, we can't call Donald Trump a threat to democracy. Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, and saying so is not incitement. Opposing political violence does not mean ignoring authoritarianism. And Jonathan Chait is a centrist. Okay, I don't agree with everything he says at all times, but he makes a pretty compelling case here. Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. That was true before an assassination attempt was foiled on his golf course Sunday, and it remains true after. Political violence in general, and assassinating political candidates specifically, also poses threats to democracy. There is no contradiction between these ideas whatsoever. Yet Trump supporters have responded to both attempts on his life by muddying the waters, exploiting the near tragedies with cynical efforts to redefine critiques of Trump's authoritarian inclinations as violent provocation. And then go into examples. Moderates and liberals who correctly believe in upholding democratic norms, especially nonviolence, might be tempted to understand these arguments as a species of principle. But the effort to rule criticism of Trump's authoritarianism as dangerous and out of bounds is not motivated by or related to any defense of democracy and nonviolence. It is a purely cynical attempt to foam the runway for the election of a dangerous man. The Trumpist argument has a thin veneer of plausibility. If people think a candidate is a threat to democracy, some of them will try to murder him. Quote, what happens when you continually demonize someone as Hitler, insist that he is a dictator and a threat to democracy? Asked Roger Kimball. Why? You get chaps like Thomas Matthew Crooks, who tried to kill Donald Trump at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania 2 months ago. But this is not an accurate factual description of either assassination attempt. Republicans claimed immediately following the first attempt against Trump that Crooks was a partisan Democrat, exploiting the long lag between the shooting and the investigation that ultimately concluded that he wanted to murder a famous presidential candidate and deemed Trump an easier target. The second shooter, Ryan Wesley Ruth, has veered wildly across the political spectrum, as we've discussed. There's a more serious conceptual problem with the argument that denouncing Trump as a threat to democracy inspired violence. It ignores the truth or falsity of the matter. Taken at face value, the argument implies that we cannot say a presidential candidate threatens democracy even if he plainly does. A party could nominate a candidate who openly promises to end elections and imprison all his critics, and the opposing party would be prevented from describing this candidate as a threat to democracy for fear of inspiring assassination attempts. That would be a strangely self-defeating application of democratic norms. As it happens, this is not the principle conservatives are advocating. Rather than claiming it's dangerous to call a candidate a threat to democracy regardless of whether it's true, they are insisting that Trump is not a threat to democracy. They are further insisting that Democrats are a threat to democracy. Okay? And it goes on like this. The very remarks that they are citing include Trump calling his opponents a threat to democracy gives the game away. The fact that they're proud of this line rather than embarrassed by it reveals the utter lack of principle behind it. Quote, what will it take for those demented partisans to lower the temperature? Demands Divine with a comical lack of awareness. So, what are we talking about? Well, the fact of the matter is, number one, Donald Trump is an authoritarian threat to democracy. That fact remains unchanged regardless of the assassination attempts against him. Number two, Donald Trump and his campaign have repeatedly accused President Biden, Vice President Harris, the Democratic Party, of being threats to democracy, threats to the country. As a matter of fact, Donald Trump used that sort of rhetoric in the lead up to the January 6th insurrection. He used it at the rally on the Ellipse, the speech on the Ellipse at the Trump rally just hours before his supporters marched on the Capitol building, broke in, engaged in insurrectionist acts, and attempted to murder the vice president. You got to fight like hell or we're not going to have a country anymore. They're destroying our country. So if what the Republicans are now saying was principled and true, they would also condemn, they would also say, hey, I believe this so strongly that I am demanding that my own party, that Donald Trump, that Republicans stop accusing President Biden, Vice President Harris, the Democratic Party, of ruining the country, being threats to democracy or anything else. They would be consistent. Consistency is a sign of principle. They're not being consistent. They're being inconsistent. They are cynically exploiting this in order to try to disarm Democrats from correctly describing Trump's authoritarian inclinations. And that's why I categorically reject it, and so should you. At the end of the day, MAGA Republicans, especially the politicians, are unprincipled. They will say whatever they want, whenever they want, about whomever they want, as long as it advantages them and disadvantages their opponents. They're doing it here too. It would be one thing if there was a principled, consistent actor who said all of the rhetoric like this needs to stop. People shouldn't call Trump a threat to democracy. People shouldn't call Biden, Harris, and the Democrats a threat to democracy. Nobody's a threat to democracy. That entire language is off limits. I still wouldn't agree with that because I think it's okay to call threats to democracy. But if somebody said that, at least they would be consistent. At least I could take it at face value that they're trying to be principled. But that's not what's happening. Fox News and MAGA Republican elected officials are attempting to blame Democrats for something that Democrats are not responsible for, and that actually Trump and MAGA Republicans have actively contributed towards, which is the normalization of political violence. Donald Trump has celebrated political violence. He has encouraged political violence. He has mocked political violence against the spouses of his political opponents. Remember Paul Pelosi? And when asked about the bomb threats going on in Springfield, Ohio, as a consequence of his and J.D. Vance's rhetoric that Haitian migrants are eating the cats and the dogs, he won't even condemn the bomb threats, which have led to school closures. So I'm sorry. I believe in single standards, and I would encourage centrists and MAGA Republicans watching, if they are, please like and subscribe, but also pick a standard and stick with it. Don't hold Trump to a different standard than you would the Democrats. And as it stands, I think it's perfectly okay to call Donald Trump a threat to democracy today, yesterday, the next day. It doesn't matter. He is a threat to democracy, and that has not changed, even though political assassinations are wrong. Thank God this did not succeed. This person should be punished to the full extent of the law. And if we want to defeat Donald Trump, we have the opportunity to do so on November 5th. So if you're an eligible voter, make sure you're registered to vote and you vote blue in November. And in the meantime, you let me know what you think in the comments.